All right, it is wonderful to see everybody here this morning. A big hello. You are welcome right throughout this session to communicate with us via chat. And I encourage any questions along the way. Be more than happy to stop and explore any areas further. So I'd just like to begin by, of course, acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on today, paying our respect to elders past and present. My name is Jasmine, and we're going to be exploring today a little bit more about difficult and challenging learners in VET. We touched on this a little while ago in another session. We're going to be exploring some slightly different areas of it in today's. Just so that I don't repeat myself for any of you, if you were here for part number 1 of difficult and challenging learners in VET, would you like to pop your hand up or respond via chat? My background in dealing with difficult and challenging learners, as those of you, thank you, who attended, great to see you again, will have heard, comes from a originally corporate background in dealing with complaints management, right through to my career of a VET teacher. I also have a teenage son and 2 other children, so they can be difficult and challenging learners as well at times. So I do experience this from the beginning of my morning right throughout my days, both at home and at work. At Excelia, we happen to have amazing students to work with who don't present us very often with those difficult and challenging situations, but I actually always enjoy it when we do get one of those situations because it kind of gives you a bit of a challenge and something to push yourself to resolve that situation and have a really happy outcome for everyone. And I find often when we start out working with someone that we perceive as being difficult or challenging in the first place, we can actually have even more positive outcomes and a extra positive response at the end of it all than we did with other learners. So difficult and challenging learners in VET is something we're all going to come across in life, and a lot of it is about your perception or perspective of this. But there are some very basic things, of course, that we can do initially to help prevent difficult and challenging behaviour. So I'm going to touch on the basics first. And forgive me if I'm repeating things that you already know and practice every day, but I think it's important to reflect on these couple of simple things. So to begin your session, to stop that difficult behaviour before it even starts, it all begins with defining the expectations. What's expected of your learners? What do you expect of them? What behaviour is expected of them? And what can your learners expect in return? This is a two-way street. And having that respect to acknowledge what they can expect in return from you as their trainer really helps them to take on board what's expected of the learners. Would anyone, good morning, Sudan. Would anybody like to add into chat what they might do when they start their session for the day in letting learners know what's expected of them? If there's any points that anyone particularly always touches on, you're welcome to share it with us there. Hi Annette, great to see you back again. Thanks for joining again. So when we're letting our learners know what's expected of them, we've got all the standard rules, turn off your phone, please don't interrupt others in the class, be respectful. We've got these standard sorts of rules. Different people might have different understandings of what's expected of them. And a lot of that understanding may reflect back on their previous learning experiences. So they may be reflecting back on a classroom that they were sitting in many, many years ago. And it's totally out of context to their current learning that they're going to be undertaking. But we still bring these experiences and expectations with us. So you've got some people sitting there thinking that they have to raise their hand because that's the last time they were in a classroom, what they had to do to interrupt. That's their perception of that. You've got some people with a different understanding of that. They might have been in a classroom that was full of ruckus and nobody had raised their hands. So setting these expectations early on, as soon as you start the session, of how you want your learners to interact with you. Do you want them to interrupt you, or do you want them to wait until you finish speaking? All trainers are different. Personally, I don't mind being interrupted if I haven't been clear enough about something myself. If I've assumed a level of understanding and gone in too high, then I always welcome my students to interrupt me. Other trainers might not like this. They might not use this strategy. They might prefer to wait for the end and go into a group discussion. So as trainers, we're all different in how we like to run our classes. And as learners, your learners are all different too. So define these expectations, explore them with the learner when you first start the class, and that will develop a really good relationship from the get-go. While you're defining these particular expectations of how behaviour and interactions are planned to unfold, you can also start to explore internal motivators. And I particularly encourage you to explore internal motivators as a group, as a whole, but also individually. It won't be long before you'll be able to see the people that naturally have internal motivation. They know why they're there, they know why they need to learn it, and they know how it's going to benefit them at the end. You're generally not going to have much problems with those learners' behaviours. Some people might not really understand why they need to know something, how it applies to them or their context, or how it's going to even benefit them in future. So exploring these internal motivators off the back of expectations helps to define the whole vibe of your room, the whole vibe of your classroom. If everybody wants to be there, they know why they're there, they know that it's going to be benefiting them, they know to expect that you're going to be helping them along that journey, and they know what's expected of them. You've already set down some pretty good ground rules, and your classroom should have a really positive and motivated vibe. And hopefully, that's going to prevent any difficult or challenging behaviours in the first place. Thank you to everybody who shared their thoughts there, and hello to everyone else who's joined us since we started. So I think we've touched on these basics now in defining those expectations from both perspectives and exploring internal motivators. Would anybody like to comment on what they feel is one of the strongest internal motivators in their classroom? I'd love to know. Internal motivators really come down to how it will benefit me, but they can vary dramatically depending on the group of learners that you're working with and the industry that you work in as well. So we often have one of the first internal motivators being promotions, job security, and financial motivations as well. And these come down to a personal aspiration to achieve more and do better. So triggering those internal motivators of how it's going to benefit you is something that you can explore in your classroom and see how you can uncover those. Next up, once you start getting into your session a little bit more, I think it's one of those things that we all understand and know to identify limitations and language literacy and numeracy skill gaps. And in many environments and larger RTOs, you might have amazing support staff to help you with language literacy and numeracy needs. So this is going to vary depending on your organisation as to whether those skill gaps have even been identified or not, and whether there is somebody else there to support you with them. They are one of the primary drivers of difficult behaviour after the first ones that we've just discussed. And we often think around language literacy and numeracy as reading, writing, and maths. But that's not, of course, all of the core skills. We do need to take these into account, but if you haven't had LLN skill testing done prior to the students starting in your classroom, there might be some unidentified gaps. And the signs of these can be very subtle. I love this example that was recently given to us by one of our students. She found that one girl in particular was just constantly late back to class. And it seemed to be that it was a rude or just not really caring attitude that perhaps was causing her to just walk in late whenever she felt like it. Maybe those expectations weren't clear or those internal motivators weren't there. But when this was actually explored a bit further, the girl didn't know how to tell the time. She didn't know what time she was supposed to be back. So she just wandered back when she thought was right and seeing everybody else had gone and no one was around anymore. And it is quite common that people could have problems and struggle to tell the time. Even with digital time these days, the fact that they haven't learnt to tell the time in an analog format can really struggle to then even use any digital time. So this particular girl sat down with her teacher and they went through the different time breaks and exactly what it would say on her phone screen when she was due back to class. It would say 1:15 at 1:15. But when the teacher was just saying, be back here at 1:15, your phone doesn't tell you 1:15, it says 15. And so that didn't correlate at all for this person. So sometimes these triggers for language literacy and numeracy can be very, very subtle, and you can assume them to be difficult or challenging behaviour, challenging of your classroom. But sometimes it's actually purely due to language literacy and numeracy difficulties that they are likely very embarrassed about and not wanting to really admit or explore. So once you help them to feel comfortable with this and understand that there is help and support there, we can start to overcome these language literacy and numeracy barriers. So that example was, in relation to numeracy. It's not always about algebra, it can be about telling the time as well. And as I said, we often think about language as far as reading and writing. We've got all these amazing support resources for reading and writing and numeracy. But I'd like to bring everybody's attention to what is listed as the first core skill in the ACSF. So if you happen to have ever had the time to read through the 200 odd page document that is our Australian Core Skills Framework, you would have found that on page 21, the first core skill that's addressed is learning. And this learning is described by two performance indicators in the ACSF. The first learning indicator is all about the awareness of yourself as a learner, your students' awareness of themselves as a learner, and the planning and management of learning. The second learning indicator in the ACSF benchmarks the acquisition and application of practical strategies that facilitate learning. So this is really benchmarking how your students are going to use their existing internal resources to learn. So two clearly defined indicators that we have around the core skill of learning. And I'd just now like to have a look at those learning indicators by levels. So this is taken straight out of the Australian Core Skills Framework. This is an excerpt of the learning indicators by levels. If you're a bit rusty on LLN, then of course we have these two indicators for each level. So we've got 5 levels, level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And for each level, there's the two indicators that we just seen on the previous screen. Awareness of self and learner as number 1, and being able to acquire and apply learning strategies as number 2. And if we have a look through these indicator levels, it's really not until we get to level 3 and level 4 as a learner, that we start to see things like achieving learning outcomes and begins to seek new challenges. We want all of the students in our class to achieve learning outcomes. We want them to seek new challenges. But it's not until we get to a level 3 that we actually see that outlined there in learning indicator 1. So when we are at level 4, that's nearly at the top at level 5, we finally see accepts new learning challenges, explicitly designing and reflecting on those approaches to learning. So accepts new learning challenges isn't coming into the Australian Core Skills Framework until we get to a level 4. And I'd like everyone just to reflect on how many students they think would be in their classroom on the first day that are already at a level 4 of learning. I don't think that you would find that everybody is already at that level 4. At a level 3, we understand that they're beginning to seek new challenges. So that's really good. If we can see our classroom at a level 3, then we know that they're beginning to seek these challenges of learning, but we might have to feed them out a little bit slower. If you have a class of learners that are sitting at a level 1 or 2 in this core skill area, then they're really only demonstrating a little bit of awareness of themselves as a learner. So the very first point in relation to setting down those expectations is really going to help these learners to understand themselves, who they are and what their role is in your classroom, because they actually only have some awareness of that already. Even at a level 2, we're seeing demonstrate some awareness of learning strengths and the areas of needs, and they only just are beginning to plan and manage their own learning process. So keep this in mind next time that you assume that everyone in your class should be accepting new learning challenges and explicitly reflecting on what you're saying, because that means you're expecting all your learners to be sitting at a level 4 already in their core skill of learning. So what can we do about it if we see that this core skill is perhaps not all sitting at a level 4 in our classroom like we'd love? We can do a few things about it. We are considering learning as a skill in those 2 separate indicators. So we've got 2 areas of skill to develop: their awareness of themselves as a learner, their ability to plan and manage their own learning. And in the second indicator, we can also help them to acquire and apply strategies that will help them to learn. If we look at these 2 indicators separately, we can take a few different actions. So what can we actually do about it? I think this is what really comes down to the practical side of things. In developing the indicator level number 1, we're seeking to develop the awareness of self as learner. And one of the key things that we can do is provide positive encouragement ourselves, but also encourage our learners to reflect. Through self-reflection, we can become more critical thinkers, and we can also start to plan our own learning goals. So it can help to define those boundaries of a learner of what's expected of them, but it can also help them to be confident in the skills and abilities that they do have already, which as adult learners, we all come in with a level of ability and a level of preconceived ideas. So helping our learners to be aware of their strengths will increase their confidence in their skills, but also helping them to be aware of their weaknesses is something that we don't necessarily want to uncover, because we've already got somebody with difficult and challenging behaviour, perhaps disrupting the class. So if we start by focusing on all their strengths and positives, but we don't look at the weaknesses at all, we're not necessarily deflecting that type of behaviour. we're just promoting and pumping them up a bit more. So we don't want to just make their heads bigger. We also want to pull them back into line a little bit too, potentially. So being aware of not only your strengths, but your weaknesses as a learner will help you to develop your own management of learning and be aware of the fact that you are actually sitting there as a learner seeking to learn new information. So positive feedback, positive encouragement is something I'm sure that you all already do. Self-reflection takes this a step further, and identifying in that self-reflection themselves, their own weaknesses, can help the learners to have a more positive behaviour and attitude. Reinforced feedback and planning. So we all give feedback, it's a part of our job role. And we can give this feedback in positive ways that encourage self-reflection. But we also want to ensure that this feedback is provided in a way that it is still taken on board. So if you've just popped it through in some writing, it's probably a good idea to sit down and verbally chat through it and make sure it's understood, that it's taken in the right light. Because often when we're just reading feedback, we're not seeing the smile that was behind it. We're not feeling the helpful, thoughtful feelings that were behind it. We're just receiving constructive criticism. And it doesn't always come across the way that you intended. So if you're just providing written feedback, then sit down and verbalize it and chat through it as well, and make sure that that feedback is understood. Explore the questions that the learner has around the feedback. If you are just providing your feedback verbally, likewise, it might not actually be taken on board the way that you think that it is. So reinforcing that feedback through providing it in writing as well is going to help ensure that it is taken on board and taken seriously. In just providing feedback, we're not really helping our learners to take the next steps, and we could potentially be encouraging further difficult and challenging behaviour. So to go another level over just providing feedback through multiple communication methods is to actually help the learners understand what are they going to do about that feedback. And this only needs to be some very short and simple steps. Telling them what they need to do for the entire rest of term probably isn't going to help. Telling them what the next 2 or 3 immediate steps that they need to take are is going to make things nice and clear and give them a direction that ensures that you're not getting interrupted or difficult behaviour arising in a group as a classroom, because it's really clear what those next steps are that they need to take. And I'd just like to touch on this point in feedback and planning what we're going to do about that feedback, that it's really important to take this on yourself as well. Seek feedback yourself as a trainer and understand that difficult or challenging behaviour could potentially be coming from your own behaviour or facilitation. If you have maybe overestimated the existing level of experience and knowledge in your classroom, if you have assumed their understanding of a particular idea or process, you've assumed that everybody knows how to do that. So take it on yourself a bit as well, and take that responsibility to not just deflect it all on the learner, but understand that there's things that you can do too based on their feedback that can help them to learn and help to achieve those learning outcomes that you're looking for. Number 3 leads on from that a little bit. You're looking for a shared responsibility. So take that responsibility on as a trainer. Ask the learner, is there anything better that you can do? Is there something that I'm not explaining properly for you? Is there a different way that I could explain or approach this? And take that shared responsibility. If a learner sees you taking responsibility, then they're going to be more encouraged to take responsibility themselves for their own learning. And through a shared responsibility, we're then uncovering more and driving more those internal motivators of the reasons why we're there. Being responsible for those learning outcomes because we understand how it's going to benefit us and why we need to learn this. And as a trainer, being responsible for what we're delivering because we understand why our learners need to know this and why they're there. Those 3 key points, and applied in your classroom, will hopefully help you develop your learners' awareness of themselves as a learner and help to develop their planning and management of learning. Of course, I just like to stress again that as adult learners, everybody is going to be different based on their previous experiences coming into your classroom. So look at this individually in providing encouragement, self-reflection, feedback and planning, and sharing that responsibility is an individual journey. Not everyone in your class is going to have had the same experiences. Looking at indicator number 2, the acquisition and application of practical strategies that will facilitate learning. This one can be a bit trickier. How do we help somebody acquire and apply strategies for learning? To start with, we need to increase their confidence in taking risks. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, have you seen my learners? They're so overconfident. They're talking over the top of everyone in class. I don't think we need them to have any more confidence. But in actual fact, although they have a great personality full of confidence, you may find that they're very unconfident in the subject matter that's being presented. Thus, they're deflecting and showing confidence in other ways. They're showing their confidence to speak out and disrupt your class because perhaps they're not confident in the tasks that are being set or the information that's being delivered. They're not comfortable to take the risk of speaking up in class and answering a question just in case they're wrong. And they're not confident in taking the risk of potentially admitting that they don't know something. So how do we increase this confidence in risk-taking and confidence as a learner? We can begin by scaffolding our learning activities to reduce any risk of failure. Starting with very simple, easy learning activities below the level that we're looking to achieve our outcomes at will ensure that you, as a learner, your learners experience these little wins along the way. And the more that they achieve positive outcomes in the first initial steps, the more confident that they're going to be to take a little bit more risk in the next learning activity and a little bit more. So scaffolding learning activities back well below the level that we're going to be pitching at and very slowly increasing the level of skill required is going to increase this learning strategies and the application of learning strategies. Introducing new concepts very, very slowly. We already have all this amazing, wonderful information that we just want to share with our students. We're motivated as trainers to tell them everything we know. But that's very overwhelming for someone that has no prior understanding of a concept or idea, or has a misconception of a concept and an idea due to previous experience. So you're really going to need to rein it in and take very slow steps in introducing an idea. Setting some repetitive activities. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied on that one. Repetitive activities. Very slowly increasing that information is going to require them to continuously recall the little pieces that are coming in. And the more that we're recalling that information, the more that we're getting involved as a learner and taking responsibility for our own learning. Of course, recall is a very important strategy, and part of learning is the ability to recall the information, not just cram it all in there and then never be able to find it again. We've got to be able to retrieve that information. So helping our learners to retrieve information is setting repetitive tasks and looking at very small amounts of information at a time. And quite right, Mohammed, sometimes we just have very, very shy and introverted learners. They don't feel confident in speaking up or confident in their own abilities. So using this strategy of small, repetitive, scaffolded activities will certainly help those characteristics in a learner as well. Individual strategies. So I've mentioned individual a couple of times. We touched on this at the end of the indicator level 01.01. Individually, we want to be recognised. Individually, we all want to be a little bit different in our presentation of ourselves. We don't want to all look the same. And it's the same on the inside. Individually, we want to be respected that we might think a little bit differently to somebody else. But it's also our individual responsibility that will see us achieve more as a learner. So in developing a simple plan for learning strategies with a student one-on-one, but not telling them what their learning plan is, actually asking their input into the plan. How do you think you could achieve this goal? This is the next step. So in the previous slide, we discussed going through managing the next steps. We've made it clear this is the next step, but asking the learner to put it into their own words in their plan is helping them to take responsibility for their own learning. It also helps to reinforce the information that you're delivering because they clearly understand what the outcome is and why they need to know it. So setting down an individual learning plan that you haven't yourself gone and typed off and said, here's your plan, here's what you've got to do about it, but actually asking them to plan it with your support and encouragement is going to make a big difference in their understanding of their learning outcomes, expectations, and internal motivations. The third point that I have up here is encourage critical thinking. I am a big fan of critical thinking, both in the classroom and in your personal life, and it is a fantastic strategy to facilitate learning. It is not something that everybody naturally has an ability to do. Critical thinking is something that we need to practice as a skill. Just as learning is a skill, critical thinking is a skill. And if we just keep ploughing on forward through the class, we're not giving time for thinking to develop as a skill. So take that time to allow for thinking and reflection. Don't just move straight from one subject into the next because you've got to get it done by 5 o'clock. Because if you're not going to achieve those outcomes, you're really probably just wasting your time and the learners. Taking a little bit of extra time to allow for reflection can make all the difference to the learning outcomes and the behaviours that you experience in your classroom. Encouraging this time for thinking both individually and as a group discussions, exploring preconceptions and assumptions, and really benchmarking how does everyone else in the room think and feel about this, allows that time for it to settle in and for reflection on our own values that we might have put against a concept or idea. Going over the same concept again using analogies allows time for free thinking. So you can explore it from one perspective, and that might sort of trigger in half of your students maybe something that they identify and relate to. But using another perspective and another analogy to explain the same concept over and over will allow time for thinking and will help you to reach more of your classroom in triggering those connections of previous experiences and ideas. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your contributions. Annette, group discussion can be one of the most valuable learning methods in just naturally bringing out those practical strategies that facilitate learning. And what would I describe is at the heart of competency-based learning? That is a beautiful question. It's very well written. I might need some time to think about it and I'll come back to it for you. So we've discussed developing these learning skills in our students to prevent difficult and challenging behaviours, but also to recognise those difficult and challenging behaviours as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to help somebody. It's an opportunity for you to achieve an even better outcome than what you thought. It's an opportunity for you to develop a relationship with your student individually. And it's an opportunity for you to learn and grow as well in how you can create a happier and more positive environment in your classroom by setting and defining expectations and boundaries. And that will probably bring me back to what's at the heart of competency-based learning. We have a set of standards. And at the end of the day, we, in black and white terms, could say that those competency standards are at the heart. We have to ensure that everyone meets these standards. But we know in our own hearts that everyone is always naturally going to be at varying abilities. So the heart of competency-based learning is as a facilitator, ensuring that all of your students reach those learning outcomes and objectives that are set down in the unit and don't fall below those objectives right throughout your training. That to me is the heart of competency-based learning. It's the training that brings together all of these aspects that are defined for us in a standard to ensure that all of our students, regardless of their learning levels or their reading or their writing, that everybody reaches this same outcome. Because from a competency-based standard, we then go into a national standard. We want to ensure that everyone across Australia, no matter where they're studied, has achieved these same outcomes. And as a trainer, you want your students to excel and succeed. So the best that we can do to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to achieve the standards set down in a unit of competency is really what's at the heart of it for me. There is no reason why we should have anybody left behind with the resources and support that we have available these days, even in smaller organisations, but particularly in larger organisations. We can identify these skill gaps and we can actually do something about it. But if we're not aware of it in the first place and we are just ploughing straight ahead with the set of competency standards, assuming that everybody knows what we want them to do and how to get to that level, then we're probably not being the best trainers that we can be. We're just doing our job to that set standard. So if you want your learners to go over and above that competency standard and you want to get the best behaviour and attitude from them, then as a trainer yourself, go in with the best attitude and practice that you can. And that's going to help everyone to be better themselves as well. So I think it really comes down to a positive and responsible mindset. If both parties are taking responsibility, both us as the trainer and the learner themselves, and we're both keeping a positive attitude about the opportunities for learning, then we're going to help prevent difficult and challenging behaviour. It's always going to arise because that's the trigger. That's the trigger that there's something more for you to do. That's the trigger that you can go above and beyond in your job to help this person. So the opportunities are always going to arise, but we need to see it as an opportunity for development and not necessarily a negative impact on our classroom. Does anyone have any questions or any specific scenarios they'd like to share with us? We did have a comment previously that someone has some very overconfident students in their class, and notice they tend to talk a lot about out of topic activity issues because they are in fact worried that they'll get asked questions on the subject matter and they don't have the right answer. So absolutely, this is a really common reason for us having interruptions in our class from overconfident students, as we touched on. And I think that that's been reinforced there. I can see by at least one person in our comments. So I really hope that this session has explored further how we can help difficult and challenging learners in the classroom environment, and how we can recognise the different areas that we can provide support in, but particularly in that core skill of learning to begin with. Of course, last time we touched on lots of other strategies for communication. And so if we bring these two together, if we are using our communication strategies and we are using our learning strategies, then we can certainly achieve some amazing outcomes. So that's it from me. Thank you everybody for coming along and joining. I really, really appreciate your time out of your busy schedule. And I hope that this helps not only each of you individually, but also your learners, both the difficult and challenging ones, as well as the ones that are as good as gold, but missing out on that extra 5-10 minutes because you were off doing something else. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.